I would like to thank the library. I would like to thank Jessica.
Hi.
Nice good little friend. And Martina, who actually has charge of the reference department. And Martina has been the one, when I brought in artifacts, she was having a blast putting things in the case outside. And today she took some of those items and she has them on the table over here. So if you didn't get a chance coming in, take a look at them because some of that stuff is pretty cool. Also, there's a basket on the table over there that has some items in that have Forest Hill Cemetery on them. So it's a little something to remember the evening by. Some of the things in there are flashlights. That's the tail end of something I've had for a couple of years, but they have not been activated. And they're replaceable regular batteries. So it's not this button cell stuff. A few items coming up that I would like to mention for the cemetery. Next month, on the 14th of May, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we are having, in memory of James Jacobs, a James Walk at the cemetery. And I think it will be pretty cool because it's going to be about people at Forest Hill who were born prior to 1800. And there's actually 22 people in the cemetery that come in that category. This program tonight, we had originally planned 2 years ago when the cemetery was 150. So we're now 150 plus 2, but the history is going to be the same. Actually, our 152nd birthday for Forest Hill is tomorrow.
Ooh.
On the display, you will see a book about the Forest Hill Cemetery. And that was printed, I wanted to say 2 years ago, but I think already maybe it's 3. But for anybody who might be interested, there are still some books available for sale at the office. So if anybody's interested, stop in the office anytime. I'm usually there from at least mid-morning until maybe 5 or 5:30. Something else that's coming up. Where is Jeff?
Right here.
Okay. I don't know how many of you know Jeff Lewis. He's a local musician. I've never heard him. A big chance. Jeff is going to be giving us at the cemetery a neat, I think, musical program. And that will be either in July or August on sometime on a Sunday, maybe afternoon or evening. Jeff hasn't totally decided yet, but we're definitely looking forward to that. And then something else that we will probably have a program coming up on. A few years ago, we buried at Forest Hill, Scranton's first Black school teacher. And she does not have a tombstone, but she now does. We have started a collection to pay for it, but the stone is actually in at the monument dealers. It came in, it was delivered to him about a month ago. So I think that we should not just schlep the stone in, but I think we should have a little something to honor the first Black teacher. A little bit about the cemetery before we talk about our founders. The work was started for the cemetery in 1868. Cemetery was chartered on April 20th, 1870. George Sanderson was the big pusher behind it. I imagine most of the money came out of his pocket. And he paid $250,000 for it. And Forest Hill is a little unusual because the land was paid for. A lot of cemeteries in the area were given the land by a coal company, but it was purchased actually from the coal company, but it was paid for. There's been very little change in the setup of the cemetery from when it was first laid out. The first burial and the first burial book is in a case at the top of the steps. And the first burial was a baby in May of 1870. The second burial was Lydia Drinker. And the third burial was actually a reburial of Richard Drinker, Lydia's husband, who was buried in the old Pinebrook Cemetery in Scranton, which was only a few blocks away, is no longer in existence. Supposedly, everyone was reburied from there. But I would guarantee that there are still some bodies left because it was families that were doing this. It was not an organization or a governmental body that was reburying. And so if you didn't have the money and you had somebody buried there, that body was going to stay there. There's about 50 acres at Forest Hill. It was planned as a Victorian garden cemetery. Sorry, Wendy, I said I wasn't going to talk about gardens, but there's a word. Meadowbrook ran through it. And when they put Route 81 in, that shut off the flow of Meadowbrook. So it does not run consistently, but it does run from time to time after a heavy rain. It was running about a week and a half ago, and it's super to see it run. And I often think of the plant life and the animal life that were eliminated when there was no longer running water. That same brook ran down through the backyard of one of our founders who lived on Sanderson Avenue. And then that brook ends up in the Lackawanna River. Now, running by the cemetery, before the cemetery came, and for a while after the cemetery, was the Philadelphia Great Bend Turnpike. Locally, the section was called the Drinker Pike. So most people are familiar with that. Well, that was part of the Philadelphia Great Bend Turnpike. But what made it really interesting was that was part of the Underground Railroad. And so I like to think sometimes that before the cemetery came to be, and it was basically woods where Forest Hill is, those people seeking freedom would stay out during the daytime at Forest Hill. They would use Meadowbrook for drinking and for washing, and I just think that's pretty cool. Forest Hill is one of the first cemeteries in the whole of the Northeast to actually have water running through it. And in the cemetery, originally, it was pumped uphill and then gravity fed through the cemetery. It was shut off, and of course it was not coming after 81 went in and it didn't run anymore. Then it was coming from the regular water company until about just before I came to the cemetery, early 1990. That water was shut off through the cemetery because people were leaving faucets running. The pipes were getting old. So there are still two places in the cemetery where there is still an old spigot. One of the things that I think I like best about the cemetery, and there is in the case, there's a book lying open about it. It was published by the cemetery in 1899. And I have it open to a picture in there of our big stone arch bridge. There are about 4 or 5 stone arch bridges throughout the cemetery, but there's only this one that's like that high. That takes traffic, the road runs over it, and then one small bridge does have a paved road over it. The others are in the woods where when the cemetery was laid out, of course, the roads were all dirt. And so it's dirt, and in the part of the cemetery that was not developed for burials is still woods. And so that's where these dirt roads are still dirt roads in there. You can follow them. Some people do walk on them. And also when the brook ran, there were 3 ponds in the cemetery that do show on old maps. And what's kind of, has always sort of struck me funny about that is somebody had a great imagination because it's upper pond, lower pond, middle pond. Couldn't you come up, they named the roads, couldn't you come up with a name for the ponds? There's lots of interesting people at the cemetery. There's old mayors, there's lots of politicians, there's firemen, including some of the early firemen and chiefs. There's policemen, there's doctors. The list just goes on and on. Lawyers, as far as I know, we don't have any Indian chiefs. We have 370 Civil War soldiers, and I think that's pretty cool. And 2 of those are actually Confederates. And one of them, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the movie Glory, but that's about the 54th Massachusetts, which was the first Black unit formed in the North. And we have a soldier who was a member of that 54th. We've got from the Mexican War, we have 1812, then the Mexican War, then the Spanish-American War, and that also involved the Philippine business going on there and into the Boxer Rebellion in China, and then World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. That's where we stopped so far. But going back a little bit before the War of 1812, there is a man buried at Forest Hill who was not a soldier, but was involved in the Revolution. But Forest Hill's history, I think, is pretty cool. Now I want to talk about our founders. There were actually 6 founders of the cemetery. 5 of those 6 are buried at Forest Hill. Number 6 is not, but we're going to talk a little bit about these men and some of the things that they did. And the main man was George Sanderson, and he was born in 1810. He grew up in Boston, then he spent some time in New York State. He became a Universalist minister, and at a church conference in Towanda, he met a young lady. Her name was Marion Kingsbury, and they ended up getting married. So George settled in Towanda and started practicing law, and he also got involved in real estate while he was there. He was the DA for Bradford County. He then went to the state legislature in Harrisburg for 3 counties, Bradford, Wyoming, and Susquehanna. And it was while he was in Harrisburg that he met G.W. Scranton, who urged George, oh, come to Scranton. It's a great place. So George came in 1854, and he came again in 1855. And when he came the second time in 1855, that was when he bought a farm from Elisha Hitchcock of about 220 acres. It ran roughly from just this side of Linden Street, which was the city limits at the time. And it went north, the other side of Vine, pretty close to Olive, and it ran north to south, east to west rather, from below Penn Avenue to Quincy Avenue. That section, and we're standing on part of it right now, or sitting, that became known at that time as Sanderson's Hill. It appears on old maps, Sanderson's Hill. Today, we know it as the Lower Hill section. He gave the land for the school across the street, which was the high school, became Central. Today, of course, it's Lackawanna College. He laid out streets and lots. He built his first home, and there's a picture of his first home on the table over there, and it was right down the street on the corner of Washington and Mulberry. Became at one time after that the Y, and today is Mulberry Towers or Mulberry Apartments right down the street. Now, I always found this interesting, and this was something that I stumbled on, and I actually saw it in 2 different places, so I believe it. Hitchcock attached a string to the sale of his farm. Sanderson was not to resell any part of that farm to the Scrantons, and he never did. So apparently, there had been for quite a while, Scranton was trying to get Hitchcock to sell him that land, and Hitchcock wouldn't sell it to him. Well, I don't imagine Scranton felt very happy when he ended up selling it to George. And don't be confused, some of you might be familiar with Hitchcock, who was in the Civil War, who wrote the history of Scranton. This is a different Hitchcock. Now, George paid for that 220 acres, $65,000. But within a few weeks of buying that, he had already sold half of that land for the $65,000. So he was pretty shrewd. In 1855, Nora, grab a seat.
Oh, no.
Excuse me. I don't know how to stand in back there.
Is there one up here I can sit?
Any
Yep.
place you want to sit,
I'm sorry.
I'm just happy to see you. In 1855, when George settled here, he opened a bank, and it was called George Sanderson and Company. Now, this was the second bank to be started in Scranton, but it became the longest, was around. I've often been going to track it to its end, and so far I haven't done that. But I did come across, and that's over there for display on that table, a check from Forest Hill from 1877. I was actually going to try to find check number 1, but when I saw 1877, I grabbed it because I learned something from that check. I knew that it was first George Sanderson and Company, and then it was Lackawanna Valley Bank. Well, that check told me that at one point, both names appeared on the check. And that check is actually check number 5. So that tells me that the 2 names were combined just prior to when that check was written. Now, by 1863, George had opened a law office in Scranton with a friend, Charles DuPont Brett. And then George reached a point where he was at least thinking of semi-retirement, and so he moved from Scranton to Germantown, but he kept his businesses in Scranton. But George seems to have fallen in love with Scranton, and 3 years after he left, he moved back. This time, he seems to like farms. He bought the Whaling Farm. The Whaling Farm was the start of Green Ridge. Here again, he laid out streets, lots. One thing that he put in was the horse-drawn streetcar railroad, which was something early on, was horse-drawn. did run on tracks. So he put that through, and that ran every hour. And then several from the city to Greenridge to Providence. Also, several times a day, trains for Carbondale, New York, and Philadelphia departed from the station at Greenridge. If you know where that overpass is on Greenridge Street, that didn't used to be an overpass always. It just ran ground level. And that was where the station was right there near Greenridge Street. And then speaking of Carbondale reminds me of something. When Carbondale was incorporated as a city in 1861, guess who had been working actively for this in Harrisburg? Yep, George. So he was a very busy man. He gave the land for the Greenridge Library, the Presbyterian Church in Greenridge, and when Scranton started as a city in 1866, they were a borough before they were a city, sorry, so it was 1856 to 1866. I don't know the reason why, but Burgess would only serve a one-year term. But George served, he was number 2, and he was number 9. So people back then, I think, certainly must have been impressed with Mr. Sanderson. I don't think that he gets the credit he deserves for the development of what we know as the city of Scranton. One of the things that he did was he was a backer for his son-in-law Sturgis with the electric streetcar. If George hadn't given the money, there would have been no electric streetcar started in Scranton by E.B. Sturgis. I think he was a quiet man from all I've ever seen or read, but I think he definitely had goals, and I think he just went about his business with any fanfare, because he never seemed to be one who would toot his own horn, and that always impresses me. You know, do what you do, and you don't have to advertise it, just do it. He built his second home after he bought that whaling farm in Greenridge. He built that on what we know today as Sanderson Avenue, but back then was 7th Street, because every street running east from Main Avenue, Ross, Gardner, Mayoff, the Von Stork, and all the way even up as far as this cemetery, which is Jefferson. They were all names, they were all streets, not by number. First Street, Second Street, like Mayoff Avenue was First Street. So it was 7th when he built his home. He built his home next door to his oldest son, James Gardner Sanderson, who was more often referred to as JG. George's home is still there, but it has been stucco, and so you don't appreciate it. JG's home next door was a beautiful stone home, which has been torn down, I think, prior to 1950. But there's a picture, but I have a picture of JG's home, and over on the left-hand side, kind of in the background, you can see part of his father's home. So it gives you an idea, at least, what it did look like before they slapped stucco on it. But about that same time was when George started thinking there was a need for a cemetery, because Scranton City Cemetery was Pine Brook Cemetery, and already it was being encroached by rail tracks, mining, coal dumps. So with 5 of his relatives and friends, George set out to find a location. George died April 1st, 1886. The next day, the Scranton Republican, the morning newspaper, said, "The community was grieved to hear yesterday that the Honorable George Sanderson had passed away from this life. The closing of a long, a useful, and an honorable life must always be viewed with great regret." Every family in Green Ridge was represented at George's funeral. A little bit about George's wife, Marion Wallace Kingsbury. She was born actually in Shetland, but died in her home on Sanderson Avenue. She was born in September of 1815. She was considered by everyone to be a great help to George. She was quiet, and her life centered totally around her husband and her children. They were married in Towanda in 1835. They lost their first child when she was only 16 years old. Emily was reburied at Forest Hill Cemetery in 1872. When George died, Marion was sick. She died 3 months after he did. The only flowers at her funeral were 3 pillows: Father, which was placed on George's grave, Mother, and Grandma and Grandpa. Marion was never told that George had died, because when he passed away, she was really sick. This newspaper comments that it was a rainy day for her funeral. But as the procession entered Forest Hill, the sun came out, shining brightly as if in welcome. Marion Street and Kingsbury Road were named for Marion, George's wife. And then we come to their oldest son, who was James Gardner Sanderson, known as JG. And he was born in Towanda, and he was quite an accomplished man. He was an inventor. He was a civil engineer. He was involved in banking. He was involved in commission and exchange business. He was in real estate, and with his father was one of the founders of the cemetery. JG seems to have been very close to his father, even going so far as to build his house next door to his dad. On the table over there, there is a map from, I think, about 1870, 72. JG's house is marked. George's house is marked. They were on Sanderson Avenue, just off Greenridge Street. On the other side of Greenridge Street, there was a house on the corner. That was Elisha Finney's home. Today, it's what I lovingly refer to as a block of blazes, because they put a row of townhouses in for that home down. And the house next to it was J. Atticus Robertson. We're going to hear a little bit more about him. Like his brother George, that we will talk a little bit about, JG was involved with the ASPCA. The family seemed to be quite involved in civic things. And now see, there they are helping animals. And actually, JG's wife, who was Eliza McClure, was a founder of the Old Heinemann Hospital. So there again, we have this family being involved in so many things in the area. When JG died, and I find this interesting, his wife Eliza moved next door to live with her sister-in-law, Anna. How many people are going to move in with their sister-in-law? Not many, believe me. So that tells me what kind of a family that was. Now, his wife Eliza and his brother's wife, Lucy. We'll talk a little bit about them, but I'm not sure which wife it was. But when she got married, one of those wives, her father's wedding present to her was her weight in silver. And I often think, what kind of silver? Tea service or something? Or was it bars of silver? And what happened to it? That question comes to me very often about a lot of things. What happened to it? J.G. organized the Union Switch and Signal Company, which he later sold to Westinghouse. He was very active in his church, which was the Church of the Good Shepherd, and was not at that time, we know it today, on the corner of Electric and Washington. And then there was the younger brother, George Sanderson Jr. He was also born in Towanda, and when his father died, he took his father's place at Forest Hill. He graduated from Harvard Law School. He was a member of, get this, the Luzerne County Bar, the Lackawanna County Bar, the Massachusetts State Bar, and the Philadelphia Bar. I think maybe he was a pretty good lawyer. He was involved with the City Guard, which actually later became a part of the National Guard, the old 13th, and it's today the 109th. And he became a colonel in that organization. And like his brother, I mentioned, he was involved with the ASPCA. He was on both city councils. Today, there's only a city council, but originally there were two. And it was like the upper house and the lower house, because it was select council, common council. And he was actually, at points in time, a member of both of them. And then he took over just about all of his father's businesses, including being at Forest Hill. He lived on North Washington Avenue, just off Greenridge Street. His house is still there. They have just recently been adding an addition on the back of it after all these years. His wife was Lucy Reed Jackson. So it was either Lucy or Eliza who got their weight in silver. And among other things, she, like her sister-in-law, was the founder of the Old Harmon Hospital. And then the youngest child for George and Marion was Anna, who died at home in 1926. She never married, but took in her sister-in-law to live with her. Okay. She was active in many civic organizations and also in the Church of the Good Shepherd. She was also involved very heavily in the Home of the Friendless. When she died in 1926, her estate was worth over $125,000. Almost $34,000 of this was shares in the First National Bank, which was the descendant of her father's original bank. And then George and Marion had one other daughter. She is not at Forest Hill, so I'm not really going to talk about her, but she married E.B. Sturgis. They did marry a little girl there, but they're not there. Okay, we move to the next founder of the cemetery, who was General Elisha Finney. He was a member in the early 1800s of the state militia, retired just about the time of the Civil War. He was born in Elizabeth, New Jersey in 1814. He moved with his family from there to Dundas, which at that time and for a while after they were living there was quite a thriving community. Today, it's more or less just a dot on the map, but it was definitely up and coming back in. And then he came to Scranton around 1861. When he first came here, he was boarding at the St. Charles Hotel. And I find this interesting because a man that we will talk about in a little bit, a founder of the cemetery, was a nephew of George Sanderson. And he never married, so he always lived in a hotel in Scranton. The Valley House, the St. Charles, I think there was one other. So that's where they would have become acquainted, and that explains how Elisha Finney became involved with the cemetery. Knew the nephew, got to know the uncle, okay, let's go. Because by 1870, he was living in that house in Greenridge that has since been torn down. While at the St. Charles, like I said, he must have met George Kingsbury, because they were both there at the same time. Now, he was involved in like a whole ton of stuff. Canning, glassmaking, banking, railroading, mining, and that just names a few of the things that he was involved in. His first wife died before he came to Scranton. So she is not at Forest Hill, but his second wife is, and a son and a daughter of Elisha's are both buried with him at Forest Hill. And then there was another man, and I always was kind of intrigued by this guy. His name was John Atticus Robertson, but always was known as, and signed his name normally as just J. Atticus Robertson. And the Atticus, so named because he was actually born in Athens, Greece. His father was an Episcopalian minister there. But when he grew older, he went to Trinity College up in Cambridge, Mass., and he graduated from there in 1854. 4 years later, he had married his wife, Margaret, and they were living in New York City. That's where Margaret was from. He had studied engineering. He surveyed the first railroad line running down the East Coast to Pensacola, Florida. Then we find him in New Orleans. From there, he went in search of oil in Texas. Guess what? He found it. Then he worked for the Kansas Pacific Railroad. Then he came back east and worked as an engineer for the Brooklyn Water Works. Prior to the Civil War, and I always thought this was of interest, he was assistant engineer to Olmsted in laying out Central Park. And of course, Olmsted has ties to the library. After the Civil War started, work was suspended on Central Park. And so by the time the war was over, J. Atticus was not in New York any longer. During the Civil War, he was working as an engineer for the Union in the erection of defense at several forts. And then he came to Scranton in 1867, and he was employed by the Baltimore Coal and Union Railroad, and he was in charge of the construction of the rail line between Scranton and Wilkes-Barre. Guess what? This became the Delaware and Hudson. He surveyed for the Ridge Turnpike, which is Boulevard Avenue. Takes off from Greenridge Corners and runs through Dixon City. So he was, again, very involved in so many things in building up this area. He was instrumental in the first asphalt paving that was done in the city of Scranton. His wife, Maggie, like I said, was from New York. She's actually born in Brooklyn. And she was very active in, among other things, the Church of the Good Shepherd. In fact, the first service, the first service for that church, which did not have a building at that point, their services were actually held in the Robertson home on Sanderson Avenue. And that was in 1868. And like I said, I think, well, see, there we have George going from a Universalist minister to becoming involved in the Episcopal Church. And it seems like a lot of the original people living in Green Ridge were Episcopalians. No children survived, but Maggie, and I have a copy of this that I did not run. Excuse me. She deeded her home to a niece, but right in that deed, she was retaining the coal and mineral rights underneath that property. And like I said, that house is still there. And then we come to the last man who's actually buried at Forest Hill. That was George Scott Kingsbury, and he was actually a nephew of Marion Kingsbury Sanderson. He was born in Towanda, and I mentioned previously, he never married, so he never had a house. He boarded at various hotels in the city. He seems to me to have been very close to his Uncle George. Really seemed to stick with him. He worked for his uncle in the bank. He was involved in the cemetery with his uncle. I never heard of anything about him having connections to the law practice, but, you know, again, who knows? But, you know, all these right there, kind of at George's elbow. In one time in 1867, George was living in an apartment over Sanderson's bank, where he happened to be clerking at the time. But one night, two masked robbers broke in, demanding the key to the bank vault. They bound George, they gagged him when he refused their demands. He told them he didn't have the key. They left him severely beaten. In the early morning, after freeing himself, he managed to somehow get some help. He suffered the effects of this attack for many months after it occurred. And it was said of him that his work ran like clockwork. If you wanted him at a certain time, you knew where to find him. And then we have the only one of the 6 founders who is not buried at Forest Hill, and he was William Brett, and he became a friend of George Sanderson's. He had already purchased his lot, like all of the other founders, but 6 days after the cemetery was chartered, he died. So in spite of already having a lot there, his wife, who was a DuPont, took him back to Wilmington for burial. That was where they had come from. It had not been in Scranton all that long. But one of his sons, who, he's not buried at Forest Hill, but he's a guy that I like. And his name was Charles DuPont Brett. And he immediately stepped in and took his father's place on the board at the cemetery and took all of his father's businesses over. Charles was, he was one that was with George Sanderson when Sanderson opened his first law business. Now, he buried, Charles did, he buried 2 of his little boys at Forest Hill, but then he and his wife got divorced. She moved back to New York. And Charles eventually ended up remarrying. And I said this to John earlier, and I'm going to say it again. When he died, his second wife called him to New York, where she also was from, for burial. And I always say, curses on you. You should be with us. And then the 2 little boys were reburied on Charles's sister's lot. So we do have some of the Breck family at Forest Hill because Gabriella and her husband, some of her children, and her brother's 2 little boys are buried at Forest Hill. So everybody that we talked about, except the Bretts, with the exception of Gabriella being there, they're all buried at Forest Hill. I would invite you to come.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but what is Gabriella's last name?
Pardon?
What is Gabriella's last name?
You come.
Oh,
Oh, the one that's buried?
yeah,
The sister Swift.
thank you.
So I would invite all of you, to come to the cemetery anytime you want to. You can usually catch me there most times, and I'll be glad to show you where these people are buried if you're interested in visiting their lot. The flyer that just printed does have pictures of their tombstones. So you can, and this one, oh, they're all, except for Robertson's, they're all, like roadside. Michael, you probably walk by them all the time.
I see them daily.
Yes.
So do the girls over here. They see them all the time also.
And
John
I
and
thought
Chris, John and Hannah.
that George Kingsbury had a really cool grave because he's got a headstone, and then in front of it, in granite, the grave is outlined. And actually behind that, I notice every year, there is a columbine that comes up. I have no idea how long it's been there. In this picture, you can see there's greenery, because at one time I dug up some hosta that was just in the woods and planted it in there. Still comes up every year. Does anyone have any questions?
I'm Sanderson. I was wondering, in a general sense, can you put it in perspective in terms of what the Scrantons were doing in Scranton? That Sanderson at the time.
Well, that was when they were involved with steel mills, with Scranton.
The steel, oh, okay.
No comment. I was gonna say something else. Oh, I'll get in trouble.
Norma.
Yeah.
There's a gravestone named Christmas,
Yes,
pretty close to your house. Can you have any information?
that's actually the last name of the family. That's a pretty good sized stone, and again, that's, right near the road. And there are people who come every Christmas time just to stop by the Christmas stone. They were early settlers in Providence, shoemaking originally. They were very involved with Norris Church, Shiloh Baptist. That was originally Dr. John's memorial, and the Christmases were very involved there. In fact, for the original of that church, which was in a different location before where they are now, the first services for that church were held in the Christmas home. A couple of the Christmas women never seemed somehow to marry. A couple of them were teachers. One of them taught in the oral school in Philadelphia. So they were, a pretty interesting family. And I, it's cool. Is that really their last name? Yeah.
There's a lot of gravestones that just have numbers on them, especially up by the Bucktown Trail.
Okay. Some people like to use the word popular. Oh, I don't talk about that. But I mean, common sense tells you that there were people who could not afford to buy a lot. Now, the original lots were all 8 grave lots. So if someone in the family died, there would be a single grave purchased for them. On very rare occasions, if it was a married person, The spouse would either have enough money or be capable at that point of thinking straight and would reserve the grave next for themselves. But that was on very rare occasions. So there are husbands and wives and some of their children scattered throughout the cemetery. So there are sections in the cemetery that were designated as single grave burial spots. That stone with a number on it is their burial number. There is just as much information recorded at the cemetery for someone in a single grave as there is on someone who's buried on their family lot. If somebody comes to me and asks, where is so-and-so? And it ends up there in a single grave. Most times, those people never got a tombstone, so they will just, but I consider that with a number on it, their tombstone. I will look for that person that I can then tell the person inquiring the number for that grave. I'll digress just a little bit. In my office, there is a big wall map on the wall, and every lot in the cemetery is on that map. Somebody originally decided that they would put the single graves on it. Well, I mean, I found it. So then somebody got smart. So in the desk drawer in the office are maps for each single grave section. Their information tells me what division, what block, and then their grave number. So I can look on one of those maps and tell the person inquiring where to go to get there. I also have on the single grave cards for most of the single graves. On the back, I have marked whether there is a tombstone or not. So I can tell the map, but they don't have to look for that number. They can look for an actual name on the tombstone.
Norma, please tell everybody how many people are buried there, because I find that awesome. And you can tell where they are and who they are in every grave.
And maybe half of them are in my head.
Yes, they are.
Now I forget the question.
How many people are buried?
Oh. There's 18,000 here. That surprises everybody. You know, I think maybe give a little bit. And it's, somebody went a little haywire at one point, because you should be able to follow burial numbers right from 1 through. And originally, lot burials and single grave burials were kept separate. So you have 2 number 1 burials, but you know by where they are, if it's a lot or a single grave. Somebody along the way jumped from, let's say they went from number 5,000 to 6,000. So you have that gap in there. So you can't follow burial numbers. So what I did one day was just go in the alphabetical book and count it. Yeah,
Could you tell everyone about the Von Stork situation?
and that intrigues everybody. There is, I would say it belongs on public square. It's a great big Scottish pink monument. It's for Von Storks, and in front of it, there are actually 2 individual tombstones that are probably about that high. There's nobody buried there.
Oh.
They were originally buried in their own family burial ground over on Main Avenue. And at a point in time, the others who were buried there were moved to Dunmore Cemetery. The old couple according to the will of a daughter who was living at that point in New York City, she said that her two sisters were in charge of things, and they were to buy the lot and rebury the parents. But there was a fight in the family. So the two old people are still buried over on Main Avenue.
There's a stone there too, right?
Yes, their tombstone is still its original spot. Yeah.
To briefly talk about Edith S. I think she's one of the most fascinating stones that's there.
Yeah, she does have a cool stone. It was Edith S., the young lady who was traveling with her father on a train, and there was a wreck, and she was killed. So the family sent a picture of her to Italy, and her likeness was sculpted and brought back, and she's in the cemetery. She is sitting. That's pretty cool. And on at least two occasions, I think at least one before I came, and then one after I wasn't here very long, some ignorant people pushed her off, and both times her head was busted off. But thanks to Pesavento, they came, put her back, sealed her and pinned her where she's sitting, and also sealed and pinned at the neck. So hopefully she's not going to fall apart anymore. And there is a couple who walk in the cemetery often, who live in Dunmore, and Natalie lost a sister just a few years ago. And her sister lives in, or did live in Russia. And all of a sudden, after her sister died, Natalie took a real liking to this statue because it reminds her of her sister. And so she has kind of adopted Edith. I noticed the other day when I was driving by that last fall, Natalie planted crocus on the lot. So there they are blooming.
No, I think I know who you're talking about, and I think everybody, John would know it, and Harry would know the boyfriend of the girl that takes care of that, or I'm not sure if they're married or not.
Yeah.
Mr. Jerome Kavanaugh,
Yeah.
a teacher. He told me the story about how the statue resembles
Mhm.
the girl's sister.
Yeah. So that's amazing.
Hi, Norma, how about, the chapel, or if you want to tell Amy or maybe tell everybody else how they keep the bodies in the bottom of the chapel?
And there are a couple of pictures over on the table of the inside. Chapel was built in, I believe, 1907. And in the floor in there is a trapdoor, 2 parts. And there is a lowering device that sits there exactly like the lowering devices they still use in the cemetery. And that a body could, if it was going to be held, it could be lowered through there. And so I did one time stick a camera through the back door of the chapel where there was a grate, and I got a couple of pictures. And so you can see in one picture, you see that on the main floor of the chapel, and then you can see some of the apparatus up above. The chapel has not been used since I'm here. It was used, and of course today, graves can be dug immediately, and everybody has a tent over the lot and take care of the burial. But often a service would be held in the chapel, and sometimes if they couldn't get that grave dug in time, and that didn't happen very often, which always surprises me when they think they were digging by hand, and sometimes had to blast rock. So Normally, someone would not be held in the chapel for very long. There was one occasion where a young boy was in that chapel for a few years, and I was kind of curious about that. So I found out the story on that from who turned out to be a sister of that young boy who wasn't even born when her brother had passed away. But she told me that they kept that body in the chapel because his mother couldn't bear to put him in the ground. Eventually they did.
Is that gentleman, Jimmy Hoffa, still in the basement?
I didn't let people.
Oh, I'm sorry.
About the cemetery too. Originally, well, 2 years after the cemetery opened, the lodge was built. And a family lived in the lodge. And about 1905, the office was built in the cemetery. Because before that, it was in Sanderson's bank and law offices. In fact, in my office is a safe that had come from Sanderson's bank that cemetery records are kept in. And then, I often think, oh, I wish there was a picture of them when they were two separate buildings. I know where, in fact, the door that I walked through from my office to my home, it was the front door for the lodge. It did not face the road like the front door does today. Then, not too long after the office was there, they built the addition in between. So it's like all one building now, basically. The family, the original family lived in the lodge for a long time. In fact, their son was just a little kid when they moved in, but his three sisters were actually born in that lodge. And I think that's pretty cool. And they're all buried at Forest Hill. So from that time on, for most of this 152 years, a family has actually been living in the lodge. There were just a few gaps in there. Hi.
How you doing? On the backside where I guess it would have been Meadow Brook, we noticed walking that way, there's looks like a grave. Is that part of the cemetery or there's a set of steps?
No. At one point, that's for Barbara Hawk. She was a teacher at Marywood. And especially at Halloween time, that was her favorite time to come to the cemetery. She used to, once or twice a year, bring some of her students. That section that's on the left as you would turn over the little bridge, that was her favorite place. In fact, a few times she'd be sitting there and she was scared. A couple of women that lived out on Electric Street because she acted kind of strange. But one of her students all came up with this idea. And actually there's a book out there called Then and Now that was written by Bill Conroy, who lives only a few blocks from the cemetery. I don't know if he's retired now or not, but he was a teacher at Marywood. In fact, he was the head of the department. And he jogs in the cemetery often. And so this teacher was apparently on sabbatical. And some of her pupils got the bright idea that they wanted to put this memorial there for her to welcome her when she came back. So there it is. It's like a tombstone.
Yeah.
And it's down in the woods, but it's on Marywood property. And then several years after that is when somebody put those steps in, because that's the route that they used anyway to get into the cemetery. strange.
Yes. One more question. There's two built-in, I don't know if
Tombs
they're,
in the bank?
yes. Is that the only vaults basically in the cemetery?
Except for the few freestanding mausoleums. And I think the tombs in the bank are kind of cool.
Yeah.
I talked to John about this. I regret because maybe 20 years ago, they were both blocked up. But one of them was starting to crumble, so we had somebody come and reblock it. But I've often thought, Norma, why weren't you smart enough at the time to walk in there and look around and see who's where? Too late now. And there's also, in that 1899 book that's out in the display case, those two tombs in the bank are in that book. So they've been there a long time.
No, are you aware of any reference or any indication on the cemetery map that there may have been small waterworks along Meadowbrook associated with the fountain down at Sturgis Park across from the Good Shepherd Church?
No, that would have been the same stream. And see, that runs through Dunmore Cemetery,
Mm-hmm.
but they've covered it all over a long time ago. Then it runs through us and it's completely free and open. And then it goes into the oral school.
Yeah.
And it's all open in there. And then from there on, under the ground it goes. But you're right, at one time in Sturgis Park, which is not for the pretzel people. I had to throw that in. Because somebody recently said to me, oh, yeah, and that's not what's known as Pretzel Park. Pretzel Park is those islands down further on Electric Street. And that, what this gentleman is referring to is Sturgis Park. And it was George Sanderson's son-in-law who donated the land for that little park. And his name is spelled E-S. The pretzel man is I-S. So they said, oh yeah, for the pretzels. But there was, just like in the cemetery where there were these three ponds,
Yes.
there was a pond there.
Yeah.
And then I have a picture of J.G. Sanderson's home on Sanderson Avenue, taken from the back. And you can see it running through his backyard.
Mm-hmm.
And it might be that map over there of that section of Scranton. He had a pond in his backyard. It was like any place where they were there naturally. Nobody went digging a hole in the ground. It was just where the bank was low and this ground was kind of level and a little bit below. So, the water would, if it was running heavy, it would naturally flow into these ponds before it would continue on downstream. I hope nobody's living here that gets their backyards flooded. I always say, if they left that free, instead of covering it all up, they wouldn't be complaining about flooding.
That stream was originally, the headwaters were beautiful wetlands up where the Keystone landfill is located. And that was destroyed by the Pennsylvania Coal Company, and then it destroyed the fountain. And then there was the lawsuit, the Sandersons and Sturgis sued the Pennsylvania Coal Company, and it went into the Pennsylvania Supreme Court in 1891. And unfortunately, the court found in favor of the coal company. Yeah, and that's actually a precedent-setting decision in water pollution law in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And it's been overturned by the Clean Streams Law of 1937, but yeah.
And see, originally that came from Music Mountain.
Yeah.
I would things were in great respect like they used to be. Because, you know, modern is not necessarily good, new and improved is not necessarily a good thing.
Norma, is there any relationship between the Dunmore Cemetery and Forest Hill?
No.
I notice there's a road that goes between the two.
And
I
that's
see people
there,
go through there a lot.
yeah, and that road, I'm gonna say maybe very late 1970s, maybe 1980, when Forest Hill started hiring Dunmore Cemetery to dig our graves. Then they made that road and put the gate in the fence back there. But no connection whatsoever. And may there never be.
Norma, what year was the Odd Fellows? What years did they come in and build the brick building in the back?
Well, I don't know exactly when they built that brick building, but John was asking about the Odd Fellows organization. Of course, there were several in the city of Scranton. This was the first Odd Fellows organization. And they bought a section of ground at Forest Hill that was meant for their members and families only. And that was, I'm going to say, and I'm quite sure it's right, 1878 is when they bought that. And then at some point, they built that brick shanty, which I hope this year maybe we can get a new roof on. If we don't use it for anything today, they used it because they used to do their own upkeep in their section of the cemetery. So they kept equipment in there. There's a cool stove in there. But now that organization is no longer. But in spite of the fact that they were maintaining that ground, all records, all burials went through Forest Hill. So at one point, until they let it go, there are actually, and I say, 2 records, because they were keeping records too. But I think they were keeping very good records. And that's something that I've always admired about Forest Hill. The record keeping from day one has been really outstanding. The only kind of bad part was about 1968 when there were 3 sisters who had lived in the lodge for quite a while. And Minnie was the one that was basically taking care of things, and she got sick. And so everything is there, but it's not in complete order. But also, whoever started doing it, and that would have been a member of the trustees who sort of took over. They didn't exactly understand the process, but nothing got eliminated. They were keeping the same records in the lot burial book often and in the single grave book. So better to have 2 than nothing at all. Okay, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I hope you enjoyed it.